Hi, I'm totally John Green and not an imposter, and welcome to Totally Legitimate Crash Course US History. Today we're talking about one of the early conflicts of the Cold War, the Korean War. Now, you should know I called this a conflict and not a war because, as far as the US was concerned, it wasn't a war. It was an international policing mission. The US has only declared war 5 times in its history, and Korea was not one of those times. The late 1940s were a pretty great time for the US. We had just won World War II, the Great Depression was over, and everyone was convinced that communism was going to take over the world and destroy us all. So, at the end of World War II, when the Allies divided up the Axis territories among themselves, there was one in particular that America was worried about, and that colony was Korea. Korea had, until the end of the war, been a colony of Japan. Korea was close enough to Japan that the USSR would be in perfect position to spread communism to Japan if they gained control of Korea. The US, on the other hand, was currently in control of Japan and was trying to turn it into a capitalist country, so you can imagine they weren't too happy about this. Unfortunately for the US, it looked like this was what was going to happen since Korea and the USSR shared a border. But the US had a plan to prevent this. They proposed that Korea would be split into 2 occupation zones at the 38th parallel. The USSR would occupy the north and the USA would occupy the south. And eventually the two would be reunited into one country. That plan was accepted and Korea was split in half with the promise of reunification. Things went sideways pretty quickly. Just 5 years after Korea was split, both halves were ruled by dictators, Syngman Rhee in the south and Kim Il-sung in the north, who did terrible things to their people. The only substantial difference between the two was the North was communist and the South was capitalist. Unsurprisingly, the two Koreas hated each other. Years of tense relations and border scuffles finally boiled over on June 25th, 1950, when Big Papa Stalin in the USSR gave the signal and North Korea invaded the South. Over in the good old USA, President Truman had introduced the idea of containment 3 years earlier in the Truman Doctrine. Boy, did he stick to that policy. In only 2 days, the US had convinced the rest of the United Nations that North Korea's invasion was a threat to freedom, and they led into Korea a task force that consisted of 21 countries, but was still mostly American. However, both the South and the UN were woefully unprepared for the North. The Northern Army was much stronger than anticipated. By September, the map looked like this. Enter Douglas MacArthur. Well, he didn't chess enter at this point. He had been involved since the beginning of the war. MacArthur was the American general who had been in charge of all Allied forces in Japan in World War II, and now he was in charge of all the UN forces in Korea. He led an invasion of Incheon. The invasion went very well, and the tide of the war flipped. The UN used it to drive the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border. There was a downside to this, however. The Chinese had warned MacArthur that if he got too close to their border, they would join the North Koreans in order to protect their country. MacArthur thought the Chinese were bluffing, but when the first US soldiers reached the Chinese border, they made good on that threat. The Chinese swung the tide of the war for a second time by committing over 1 million soldiers to the war. The combined Chinese and North Korean forces managed to drive the UN all the way back past the 38th parallel. The UN eventually managed to fight their way back to the 38th parallel. At this point, the USA was in an interesting place. On one hand, President Truman spent the entire war trying to not engage the Chinese because he thought that would lead to World War III. Now that China was involved, he wanted to end things without invading China and attacking them directly. General MacArthur, on the other hand, saw China as just another enemy that needed to be made to surrender, and he advocated for a full-scale invasion of China, up to and including the use of nuclear bombs. Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination. However, MacArthur returned to the US as an even more popular person because the average American understood his philosophy of there is no substitute for victory much better than they understood this whole containment thing. Around the same time, peace talks began, but no one could agree on anything, so the war dragged on for another 2 years. At this point, the war was starting to look a lot like the brutal trench warfare of World War I, and it was losing popularity among Americans fast. A young man named Dwight Eisenhower campaigned for president on a promise to end the Korean War. And people hated the war enough that in 1952, Eisenhower was elected. On July 27, 1953, the North and South finally agreed to a ceasefire. Not an end to the war, but a ceasefire. The border between the two Koreas remained in almost the same spot as it had been at the beginning of the war, and both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung were still in power. The war did have many consequences, though. To start, it destroyed Korea. The North in particular was flattened by American bombing. The South was in similar shape, but it became much better when Syngman Rhee was overthrown in 1960. Globally, the war established the idea of proxy wars, in which the USSR and USA fought each other indirectly by pitting smaller countries against each other. And along with other early Cold War conflicts, the war established the USA and USSR as the most powerful countries in the world. So, what should we learn from all of this? Well, we should learn about Key Concept 8.1, which states, there is one other lesson that the Korean War should teach us, and that's
never get involved in a land war in Asia.
Thank you so much for watching. I'm totally John Green, and I'll see you next time.